Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of ANROS, I welcome you to today's webinar, Technology Facilitated Abuse, Extent, Nature and Responses in the Australian Community. I'm Padma Raman, the CEO of ANROS. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the country upon which we meet today. I'm coming to you from Naarm. Naarm is the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. On behalf of ANROS, I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's webinar. In today's webinar, we'll first hear a presentation on the latest evidence about technology-facilitated abuse, followed by a panel discussion and a live Q&A. You can send through questions at any time during the course of the discussion, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. The two research reports launched today are available in the handouts section of GoToWebinar. If you'd like to access closed captions, please click on the link provided in the chat box. The webinar will be recorded and be available on the ANROS website as soon as possible. You can subscribe to Notepad, our e-newsletter, to be notified of when it's available. Finally, we have a survey that'll pop up as you exit the webinar. If you could take a couple of minutes to complete it, we would really appreciate your feedback. Your responses help us improve our webinar program in the future. This is a confronting topic and some participants might find it distressing. It is important to take care of yourself while watching this webinar. If you'd like to access support, please contact 1800-RESPECT. That's on 1800-737-732 or Lifeline on 131114. The use of technology to perpetrate violence against women is a rapidly growing and serious problem. Technology-facilitated abuse comes in various forms, including online sexual harassment, stalking, partner violence, and image-based sexual abuse. Today's webinar launches the two final reports, Technology-Facilitated Abuse, Interviews with Victims and Survivors and Perpetrators, and Technology-Facilitated Abuse, National Survey of Australian Adults' Experiences. From a national ANROS research study that examined the extent, nature and responses to technology-facilitated abuse in Australia. The study aimed to understand the lived experiences of victims and survivors of technology-facilitated abuse in Australia. This research is one of the first global studies to engage with perpetrators using qualitative methods to understand their motivations. As such, it will be vital in helping to identify gaps in our knowledge of tech abuse and, importantly, in exploring potential solutions to prevent, detect and dissuade tech abuse perpetration. Now onto the panel. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. Dr. Asher Flynn, Associate Professor, Criminology, Monash University, Karen Wilkes, Manager, Women's Programs at the E-Safety Commission, Joanne Yates, General Manager, Advocacy and Communications at No to Violence, and Ella Stewart, Manager, Legal Centre and Policy, In Touch Multicultural Centre Against Family Violence. We were meant to have Dr. Anastasia Powell, Associate Professor Criminology from the RMIT, and Ashanti Kulasekara, Coordinator of Direct Services Team, In Touch Multicultural Centre Against Family Violence. Unfortunately, they both have had to pull out. We would like to acknowledge their contribution in planning this webinar. The reports launching today sought to understand the prevalence of technology-facilitated abuse and what types of tech abuse are used, and understand the motivations for perpetrators and the impact of tech abuse on victims and survivors. Asha, can I invite you to tell us more about your groundbreaking research?
Thanks, Padma. I've got the... Excellent. Can everybody see the slides? I'll take that as a yes, hopefully. Excellent. Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which I'm presenting from today. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and respect to other Indigenous Australians who are joining us today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to very quickly recognise the individuals who generously gave their time to talk with us for this research. We hope that the way we present it gives evidence and respect to your voices. So I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about what technology facilitated abuse is, and then going through the very large body of research that we have in the short space that I've got. So technology facilitated abuse is a form of interpersonal violence, abuse or harassment that is perpetrated through the use of digital technologies. So some of the examples of this that we can talk about are monitoring or controlling behaviours. So this can be things like keeping track of where the victim survivor is and what they're doing. Emotional abuse or threats. So this can include sending put downs or insulting messages. Harassing behaviours, so this is often involving maintaining unwanted or repetitive contact, and sexual and image-based abuse, which also includes sexual coercion. So this can include sending unsolicited or offensive sexual texts, emails, and also the sending of non-consensual intimate imagery. So these different types of tech facilitated abuse can occur in a range of different relational contexts, and we will start to unpack some of these across the presentation. It is important to note that they can also overlap. So a survivor may be experiencing multiple forms of abuse, and they may also be experiencing it in a way concurrently with other forms of abuse beyond technology facilitated. Our project, funded by ANROS and DSS, sought to unpack the harms, nature and prevalence of technology facilitated abuse within the Australian community. So our first report, which we spoke about last year, involved a survey of sector workers in which we identified some of the key issues around training and support available. What I'm going to be speaking to today is stage 2 and 3 of the project. So this involved interviews with 20 victim survivors of technology facilitated abuse and 10 perpetrators of technology facilitated abuse, as well as a nationally representative survey, the first of its kind in Australia, with around 4,500 Australians. So to start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the prevalence of tech facilitated abuse that came up in the survey. So we found an overall high lifetime prevalence rate, with 1 in 2 Australians, both men and women, reporting that they had experienced at least one form of tech facilitated abuse across their lifetime. We had 1 in 3 Australian adults experiencing monitoring or controlling behaviours, and this was similar as well for experiencing emotional abuse or threats. And 1 in 4 of our respondents reported experiencing harassing behaviours, and about 1 in 4 as well experienced sexual or image-based abuse. So we saw quite high prevalence rates among the Australian community. We found that tech facilitated abuse was occurring in a range of relationship types. So with approximately 1 in 3 TFA victimisation experiences reported occurring in the context of either a current or former intimate partner relationship. Others were victimised by a family member, about around 1 in 10. 1 in 10 were victimised by a friend or acquaintance, and about 1 in 5 said that the TFA was actually perpetrated by a stranger or an unknown person. In terms of self-reported perpetration, we found that 1 in 4 Australian adults acknowledged that they had engaged in technology-facilitated abusive behaviours. And again, you can see a bit of the breakdown on the slide around what those behaviours involved. So we had no overall difference between men and women, however, in terms of the rates of offending, but men were more likely than women to report engaging in harassing behaviours, as well as to report engaging in sexual or image-based abuse. Australians who had engaged in any lifetime victimisation, any lifetime perpetration, also included 2 in 5 young and middle-aged adults, so that's 18 to 44 years, and 2 in 5 Indigenous and First Nations people, 1 in 3 LGBT+ Australians also reported engaging in perpetration. And we're going to explore a little bit later in the presentation why we might have seen such high rates of particularly victimisation, but also perpetration in relation to these minority communities. Almost 1 in 2 perpetrators said that the victim survivor that they'd engaged in the abusive behaviour against was either an intimate partner at the time that they committed the abuse or a former intimate partner. This is again showing this recognition of how technology facilitated abuse is playing out in the context of intimate relationships, and there was quite a gendered element to this, which we'll explore shortly as well. There was also an overlap where we saw around 20% of Australians reported that they were both perpetrators and victims of image-based abuse. So I wanted to briefly just provide some examples of the types of behaviours and the stories that we heard from our participants and the ways that they experienced the abuse. So we heard a range of different stories around how perpetrators enacted harm and how they innovatively sought to commit abuse. Participants reported both low-tech ways that they were engaging in abusive behaviours or experiencing abusive behaviours, such as threatening behaviour or messages, through to more sophisticated and high-tech behaviours, such as maliciously installing spyware on different devices. One of the most common forms of harassment that both victim survivors and perpetrators described was experiencing or engaging in repetitive unwanted contact. So this abuse was often undertaken through multiple channels and platforms, particularly when the perpetrator was blocked on one platform and they would find other ways to contact the victim survivor. Victim survivors also reported being harassed in ways that did not always involve direct contact from the perpetrator. So some perpetrators described harassing by posting defamatory comments online about a person. Some did this using their own profiles, some used this creating fake profiles, and another factor we saw was victim survivors reporting their own profiles being used by perpetrators. Again, I'm going to go through these quickly so we can get to some of the discussion as well, but these are some examples that our victim survivors and perpetrators described in terms of emotional abuse and threats. So we saw this in the context of current or previous intimate relationships most commonly, and it was achieved through verbal abusive messages or sending threats to hurt the victim or someone that they cared about. Perpetrators also reflected when talking about this type of abuse that they would escalate their behaviour if the victim survivor did not respond to their repetitive abusive comments. Perpetrator participants also reported engaging in a range of monitoring and controlling behaviours, primarily in the context of intimate relationships. So this included monitoring their current or ex-partners' online interactions, as well as their in-person movements by monitoring their technology use and facilitating in-person stalking, turning up to where the victim survivor was. We also had examples where people described having their social media accounts hacked, their Google location services and internet routers hacked, as well as being monitored through CCTV tracking devices, cameras, and audio bugs. We also had examples where perpetrators spoke about putting apps on their victim survivors' phones, allowing them to monitor their phone usage, including things like location, who they were getting messages from, and their social media identities. As I said, in the survey, around 25% of people reported having experienced sexual and image-based abuse. In the interviews, we only had one perpetrator who acknowledged this type of behaviour and 2 victim survivors who'd experienced it. For those, they had experienced it in the context of both intimate partner relationships and from strangers. So one example that we had was in the context of an intimate partner taking an image of the person during a consensual sexual encounter, but taking an image without their consent, and then posting that on numerous websites and using that to engage in threatening behaviour. To turn to motivations now, we found a range of different motivations and drivers underpinning the perpetration, but gaining and or maintaining control over the perpetrator was the most common, identified by both victims and perpetrators. This motivation was prevalent again in these intimate partner relationships, but also in relation to family members, friends, and acquaintances. So perpetrators also primarily identified feeling angry and upset as their main motivation, that they wanted to control the person or have some kind of permanency and access to their lives again. In the survey, you can see here that perpetrators agreed with a range of motivations, and these included around expressing anger, annoyance, and wanting to hurt the victim. It was much less likely in the survey for participants to identify that they were doing it because they thought it was funny or flattering. Briefly, to reflect on the harms, across the survey, we found a range of different harms that people identified, ranging from being annoyed to feeling angry, controlled, humiliated, depressed, and afraid. In the interviews, the harms experienced by victim survivors were lasting, complex, and wide-ranging. They included physical, emotional, and mental health harms, as well as feelings of fear, paranoia, and hypervigilance. So there was also a common theme of surveillance, a sense that they could never escape the abuse. The constancy of it was a major concern that came out. There were also a lack of trust in people, in technologies, in accessing support that was identified by victim survivors, and a number of mental health and physical health conditions that arose as a result of the tech-facilitated abusive behaviours. I want to end by talking briefly about the gendered nature of the harms that we identified. So this project sought to deepen our understanding of how gendered tech-facilitated abuse is. And by gendered nature, what I mean is the ways in which the extents of differing of abuse was different based on gender, or how the impacts might have changed dependent on gender. And overall, a majority of those who experienced TFA said that the perpetrator was a male in the most relevant recent incident. But women were more likely than men to experience tech-facilitated abuse from an intimate partner or former partner as compared to men. They were also more likely to experience sexual and image-based abuse than men. And importantly, what we found was that there were big differences in the way they experienced the abuse. So they experienced it in terms of fearing for their safety, in terms of the abuse being part of a pattern of abuse from the same perpetrator, and that they felt controlled by the same perpetrator. So the abuse was occurring in the context of an ongoing coercive controlling relationship. Gender was not the only factor that emerged in the study. Importantly, we found there was high and clear intersectional dimensions. So as I mentioned, there were high rates of victimisation experienced by gender diverse and sexuality diverse respondents, with almost 3 in 4 identifying as being a victim at least once in their lifetime. Indigenous and First Nations people also reported very high rates, with 7 in 10 of our respondents experiencing victimisation. Victimisation rates were also high for those who identified as needing daily assistance or as having a disability, reporting at least 3 in 5 having one victimisation experience across their lifetime. These high victimisation rates among minority groups can be attributed to the higher uptake of digital and online spaces being seen as safe among such groups as a way to express identities and seek help. But it can also lead to really the positive use of online spaces being circumvented by broader structural discrimination and harassment. So it's important to look at the rates in that context as well. In terms of our policy implications, I've listed a few things here, and we can talk some more about this today, so I'm not taking up everybody's time. But some of the key factors to come out for us were around looking at ways that we can develop safety by design principles, like the e-Safety Commissioner are working on, for people developing digital platforms and technologies, but also things like having mechanisms in place to help de-link people online. So this can include through banks, electricity, gas, where we commonly see victim survivors reporting that it was very difficult for them to separate their accounts or to start a new account without the permission of their previous partner being able to get access to that. So overall, the results show us that we've got to continue to address the substantial proportion of tech-facilitated abuse that's occurring, that it's not a unique form of abuse, but a tactic of abuse that is being used to target victim survivors across a range of different platforms, and that there really is a long way we need to go to be able to start to address some of these concerns, including recognising the motivations and the support networks that might be needed. So thank you, Padma. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Asha. I might just wait for the panelists to turn their cameras on and their microphones. Great. As we've just heard, there are various motivations that underpin technology-facilitated abuse amongst perpetrators, with gaining and maintaining control over the victim and survivor as the most prevalent driver. And monitoring and controlling behaviours were the most common type of tech-facilitated abuse. So can I start with how has technology changed forms of abuse, such as stalking, for example? Might start with Joanne.
Thanks very much, Padma, and thank you, Asha, for such an important research report. Really, overall, the findings of the report reflect Notor Violence's work in this space. Overall, technology has changed abuse because a perpetrator has access to a victim survivor, no matter the time of day, the location of the victim, or indeed the location of the perpetrator. Technology in all its forms, overt surveillance devices and spyware, regular phones, even digital watches, are increasing and dangerous levels of increasing and dangerous levels of surveillance. Those personal devices seem to be very everyday tools of personal devices don't seem at all to be threatening, but indeed they are. Some platforms are provided by customer service providers, for example, utility companies, and some are even a growing number of organisations whose primary purpose it is to monitor individuals under the guise of protecting their own personal safety. So the intersection of our lives with ever-present and omnipresent technology has certainly changed the ability of perpetrators to stalk, harass and control their partners or former partners. The other thing about that is that spyware has changed forms of abuse because it removes the physical and time frame boundaries that abusers now have to control their victim. And of course, this severely limits a victim survivor's opportunity to plan for their own safety. Victims also have a very legitimate fear that the perpetrator is already aware of everything that they are doing, undermining their own sense of safety. Help seeking, of course, may result in an escalation of abuse, and often means that women are now self-censoring and avoiding a public presence because they'll be the target of online abuse.
Great. Ella, can you talk to us about the impact of monitoring and stalking on migrant and refugee women?
Yes, thank you, Padma, and thank you, Asha, for that, for the report. Look, it's not overly different to what people in mainstream communities experience. However, there are added layers that women from migrant refugee backgrounds in particular can experience when it comes to this. So through our service, we see the importance of technology to ensure connection to the community, to networks, and in particular for clients who are here temporarily. Perhaps she's on a temporary visa and they're here, and the role that technology and social media plays to keep her connected to her family and her friends and her networks overseas is really important. But then when that is used to abuse the woman, it kind of can take a really big toll. So what we generally see is, as per mainstream communities, we'll see abusive text messages, emails, social media being used to direct abuse. But then there are also other scenarios that we do unfortunately see, such as isolating her ability to connect to her family overseas, limiting how much she's allowed to speak to her family and friends, sometimes cutting her off from them completely, monitoring her calls and messages, who she's been speaking to, whether it's her colleagues or family overseas, restricting her access to immigration and visa documents. This is sometimes a major issue for our clients, you know, particularly if she's on a spousal visa. So she's come out here because she's either already married him or they're going to be married, and he's sponsoring her, and he may limit her access so that she doesn't even know exactly what visa she's on. And then there's also some of our clients are threatened to have you know, negative or derogatory or personal information about them sent home to their families and friends overseas, which can have huge ramifications.
Thank you, Ella. And I guess technology doesn't have any borders or boundaries, so you could also be getting abused from other countries or from the country of origin.
Absolutely.
Joanne, how does No to Violence address motivators of technology facilitated abuse with perpetrators? I think you're on mute, Joanne.
So determined not to do that, I beg your pardon. I guess the first thing, Padma, to be really clear is that we should never really underestimate the creativity of men who choose to harm their partners and use technology as one additional tool in their arsenal in which to do that. Of course, technology makes it far easier for men to coerce, intimidate, harass, stalk and exercise control over their victims, as Ash's really informative presentation demonstrated. And of course, this at its most extreme level will include threats of abuse, rape and other expressions of extreme misogyny. All of this is actually about coercive control, of course, and technology facilitated abuse can often and does escalate into physical abuse. And as we hear from coronial investigations, it is an omnipresent form in the lead up to homicide in its most extreme of circumstances. Of course, from our point of view, there must be repercussions for perpetrators who seek to engage in technology facilitated abuse. We think we need a different response to inform the way we address their motivation, their controlling behaviours, as we do for coercive control generally. There's a range of different activities that we think would include improved risk identification across the specialist sector. Some of our work, for example, includes arguing for a standard assessment for technology facilitated abuse that considers a wide variety of perpetrator behaviour and includes, of course, importantly, victim survivor experiences, specialist training in understanding technology facilitated abuse for specialist men's service providers and other services and agencies that intersect with perpetrators and their use of violence. We need to encourage technology designers to design safety into their devices and platforms to guard against tech abuse and encourage protective and systemic change in the way that technology is both delivered and used. Today's research report really demonstrates the importance of an ongoing research agenda to learn more about the context, motivation and outcomes of tech facilitated abuse to enable us to develop appropriate responses. And of course, finally, ensuring that the responsibility is absolutely placed on the person using technology as a form of abuse and not the victim survivor who's experiencing it.
Thanks, Joanne. As you've said, technology is very much part of everyday life, and using tools to monitor a person is increasingly normalised as a way of showing care for someone. For example, parents install apps or monitor their children's online activities. These technologies, however, as you've said, can be used in a malicious way to stalk and control someone. How does this occur, and how should tech companies or other essential service organisations like banks or telecommunications organisations address this? Carolyn, I might throw to you first on that.
Okay, thanks, Padma. I'm just let you know I'm joining you from unceded Ngunnawal country, and I want to express my respect and appreciation for the care taken of this country by many thousands of generations and care that continues today by elders and community. As you say, technology is all around us and is created to meet a need or solve a problem, and it's not usually created with the intention of being used for harm. And issues arise when the use of the technology has unintended consequences, or when technology is repurposed in ways that abuse or harass. And technology has also been embraced across all sectors and into service delivery areas that traditionally would have been face-to-face, and this is accelerated with COVID. and many government organisations and utilities have been thrown into a service delivery model without necessarily time to prepare and consider the safety side for those experiencing or at risk of TFA, or tech facilitated abuse. I mean, an example is the banking industry, where technology has provided the ability to quickly and easily make online transactions, transforming banking for many of us. But it was an unwelcome revelation to me that abusive microtransactions are a thing, where people make low-value transactions, often as little as 1 cent, to abuse and threaten their victims. And when we hear from frontline workers that this can happen with the transfer of child support payments, with former partners issuing threats and insults along with money transfers. But with increasing awareness of these types of abuse, eSafety's worked with the banking sector, and we found them to be responsive to safety by design principles, which Asha mentioned earlier, and which are ways tech creators can build in safety principles right at the design phase of a piece of technology or tech service. The sector has begun to identify and root out online harassment and other forms of technology facilitated abuse by implementing proactive online safety measures like artificial intelligence capabilities and algorithms, which work to proactively detect and block harmful or abusive language, real-time prompts and nudges when harmful or abusive language is identified, channels for customers to report instances of harm, which include feedback loops and clear escalation pathways, and community consultation to better understand lived experiences and approaches to online safety that don't perpetuate harms. And like banks, other essential services like electricity and gas companies, they can use the safety by design principles and tools to consider from the start how their apps and online platforms could be misused by perpetrators, or how their processes can be designed to make it easier for victim survivors of domestic and family violence to navigate their way through changes in accounts without alerting the perpetrator and placing them in danger. And of course, a safety by design and trauma-informed approach will also benefit the employees of all these essential services and organisations who are also members of the community at risk of tech-facilitated abuse.
Thank you, Carolyn. Would you have anything to add to that, Asha?
Yeah, I think Carolyn's made some really important points there. I guess the only thing I would add is to also think about the ways that, say, digital platforms, social media companies can be responding to challenges that are identified. So, for example, and we've seen some really positive initiatives and responses from different companies. One example we've got at the moment is Tinder, which had an issue with their reporting policy. So if you wanted to report someone for abusive behaviour, you had to still be matched with that person on the dating app to be able to report the bad behaviour. They've recognised that this was a limitation, and they've now made changes so that you can report someone for abusive behaviour even if you're no longer matched with them. Because what they were seeing was a range of perpetrator behaviours where they were being abusive and then unmatching quickly so that they couldn't be connected and they couldn't get in trouble or removed from the site. So it's really great that we're starting to see some of these major platforms and ways that we communicate and socially engage with each other, taking on board some of the advice and particularly working with the eSafety Commissioner to be able to achieve some of these ideals.
Thank you. Your study found that tech-facilitated abuse is really gendered, perpetuated by men rather than, more likely to be perpetuated by men rather than women. How do services try to identify if tech-facilitated abuse is occurring? Ella, I might start with you.
Yeah, I think that particularly the specialist family violence sector has gotten quite good at being able to identify it. I think that when a client first comes in, for example, at our service through intake, there will be questions that are kind of embedded as part of the process where she will be asked, you know, do you have your own passwords? Can he access your email address? Do you have your own Apple ID? Like all of the questions that the case manager and the intake worker will see as relevant. And where there's a risk there, she will advise the client on what to do. For example, you should probably change your passwords, etc. And then those questions are revisited quite frequently, I believe. So there are questions about, you know, has he contacted you online? You know, has he been contacting you through social media? You know, have you heard from him? There's also something that, you know, specialist family violence services have been doing for a long time, which is asking the client, is it safe to call you on your phone? Can I message you? What are the safe times to call? And to revisit these questions regularly. So I think that our services have had to just kind of come up with these questions and ways to address the risk in that way. And there's a lot of information that our workers also provide at that point, where the client might not recognise that it's actually abuse, that the relentless text messaging, or the fact that he's still reaching out when she's asked him explicitly not to, or that he's checking his emails. It might not have quite made sense in the context of the abuse as yet. So the workers can really help her to understand that as well.
Great. And Joanne, do you want to talk about that in the context of perpetrators?
Kind of similar sort of responses, really. The practitioners that are on Note of Violence's men's referral service line, and other practitioners who work with men will often refer to the terms of an intervention order if there is one established for the perpetrator as a starting point for the conversation. Often these orders specifically restrict a perpetrator from, for example, calling, messaging or emailing a victim survivor. These kind of conversations can also explore the perpetrator's understanding of the order's terms and can discuss and explore the risk of potential breaches. This is usually where practitioners can get a better idea of whether a perpetrator is considering using technology and more specifically using it harmfully. Other feedback from the men's referral service who receive calls from victim survivors, and our counsellors specifically screen those calls for tech-facilitated abuse in the same way that victim survivor services, as Ella just described, do. For example, they might explore whether the partner checks their message history, whether they know how to delete a search history, how to remove location capability devices, and so on. Counsellors are also alert to mentions of social media, as we've heard in our conversation so far, and whether perpetrators might repeatedly check somebody's social media, because those feeds can be used specifically to stalk, harass and intimidate, either by their own profile or a hidden profile, or even misusing their previous partner's profile. Those particular issues are taken very, very seriously because we know that they're a high risk factor for jealous and obsessive behaviour, and on some risk assessments they're particularly highly rated. There are some challenges though in practitioners who work with men that face when they're trying to identify whether tech facilitated abuse exists, and one of those is to note that perpetrators don't usually intentionally disclose the true nature and extent of the strategies they use, of course, to engage in such abuse. Perpetrators often seek to deny, to minimise, to make excuses for their behaviour. As Asha has demonstrated, they just want to justify their own need to monitor their partner's behaviour. They will often report they just want to know that she's safe. They might report that she's been unfaithful previously, and so they just want to make sure that she's maintaining a faithful disposition in the relationship.
I did it too, which is what's surprising about the fact that so many men actually self-reported that they were perpetrators of tech-facilitated abuse. The research found that victims and survivors were more likely to reach out for support, but many of them didn't really know how to seek that support through eSafety, for example. Since the research was taken, the eSafety Commission has implemented some more pathways for support for victims and survivors. Carolyn, can you tell us about what the Commission's implemented?
Yeah, sure. So since January this year, with the commencement of the Online Safety Act, our powers have been bolstered to help protect Australians. A key part of the new legislation has been the creation of a new adult cyber abuse scheme. And that gives eSafety formal powers to require online service providers to remove online abuse that targets an Australian adult with the intention of causing serious harm. And also under the Act, our existing schemes have been strengthened. Our youth-focused cyber Cyberbullying scheme can now order online service providers to remove material not just from social media sites, but from all online services where children are spending time, such as online gaming chats, websites, direct messaging platforms, and hosting services. And across all our protection schemes, including the image-based abuse and the illegal and restricted content schemes, online service providers now have 24 hours to respond to a removal notice from eSafety in most circumstances, and that's down from 48 hours. And the Act gives eSafety new powers to gather information, investigate and uncover the identities behind accounts being used to conduct this abuse. And for the tech industry, the new Online Safety Act also mandates a series of co-regulatory industry codes that will require a broad range of industries to not only proactively remove illegal content, but also restrict children's access to harmful content. And the Online Safety Act also includes the development of basic online safety expectations, which will set out expectations that services are taking responsible steps to ensure Australians can use their service safely, and that they have clear mechanisms in place to allow people to report abuse and harmful material. For the reporting schemes, there are thresholds. The serious harm mentioned before means serious physical harm or serious harms to a person's mental health, whether temporary or permanent. It doesn't include ordinary emotional reactions such as distress, grief, fear, or anger. And this is a higher threshold than for children and reflects the balancing of free speech considerations and that children require additional protections. Assessment against that threshold frequently requires additional contextual information about the target and the end user because of the relational nature of cyber abuse. Consequently, eSafety will often need to reach out to complainants to seek further information about their complaint. Material removal will never therefore be instantaneous on reporting to us, as we need to establish that threshold. And harm will generally be serious when it endangers or could endanger a person's life or otherwise has or could have some form of lasting effect. But I will note here that if the circumstances and content of a complaint don't meet the threshold of serious harm, our investigators can and do still provide support and referrals to people. Examples of online material that could likely to reach that threshold are doxing, incitement of violence, threats of violence, or volumetric attacks when a person is tagged or linked to an abusive post, which others like, share, and repost with additional commentary. From the perspective of women's programs, while we've had these new powers, our key messages are about the need to prioritise women's safety and also that there are multiple options available to address the abuse. Despite the new and strengthened reporting schemes and their effectiveness, there are times when women will not feel safe to report and may still be in a relationship by necessity. And while reporting to eSafety is one of the available options, others are our online resources and the support provided by frontline workers. But as the research has made clear, we need to work to raise awareness of eSafety. And we're doing that through relationships with police and education departments and other types of services, but that's definitely a focus for us with these findings.
Ella, you said before that, specialist family violence workers are aware of technology facilitated abuse and are capable of looking out for it. But with technology constantly evolving, how do we make sure that we build a capacity or that people who work in the sector can keep up with that constantly evolving nature of technology?
Absolutely. Look, this is something that does come up for us. So whilst we are trying to catch up and understand how it looks, I think that there does need to be a more consistent approach across the sector about how to better respond to it. So that goes from, I guess, definitions, legal and legislative definitions of tech abuse, and then lots of education, not only through the community, but general sector capacity building as well, to really understand what it's like, how it can evolve. I'm really aware that, as technology is constantly evolving, so is the abuse when it's for abusive purposes. So it is just about that ongoing investment into building the capacity of sector workers so that we always understand what it's looking like, whether it's a new app or whether there's a new dating app that's come out, whether it's a new form of communication. I think it's really important that across the sector we're provided with as much information as possible, and that the way that we identify it and do the risk assessments around tech abuse is consistent as well, so that we're all on the same page.
Great. We're getting some questions in from the audience. Asha, this one's for you. Did the age of perpetrators and victim survivors skew to a younger demographic? Were there any instances of technology facilitated elder abuse? Great question.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for that question. Look, we did see higher rates of victimisation among younger cohorts, so that was sort of 18 to 44 years was where we saw the highest rates according to age demographics. And this is not surprising given that the digital uptake among younger adults is quite high, and especially in light of COVID, where all our lives turned online and that became our only way to communicate with each other. For young people, this was already something that was happening and that they were doing, so that wasn't too surprising for us. In terms of elder abuse, we had much lower rates of people responding being victims of tech-facilitated abuse in the survey, but we did have a couple of interviews with survivors who were older and who were experiencing the abuse. One was in the context of a controlling intimate partner. The other was in the context of a friend, and the abuse was based on their ability or their disability and the fact that they required daily assistance, and they received abuse from a friend who had been a former carer of theirs. And so they spoke about experiencing that and how difficult it was from this person's perspective, because they were very reliant on their digital technologies to be able to communicate with people, and it became a real source of concern and paranoia, and just that they didn't want to be on their phone, and every time it went off they thought, oh, is that the person again? So we did see it in that regard, but unfortunately we weren't able to delve into the survey data in terms of impacts beyond the person's most recent experience to really dissect some of those age demographic issues. Further research needed, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Another good question that's come through: is trolling and cyberbullying so commonplace now that people don't necessarily recognise technological abuse compared to other forms of abuse? What would you say, Asha?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you've raised, in that it has become almost a commonplace thing. And again, as I noted in terms of COVID and the lockdown, that was the way we were all engaging online, and we see an increase in reports of, say, image-based abuse, of also online hate and stranger perpetrated abuse was something that we saw an increase of during that time. I think that the fact that our perpetrator participants failed to recognise the harm of their behaviour and what they were doing was a clear indication that we tend to normalise this type of abuse. And I also think, given the high rate that we found, 1 in 2 Australians, it also indicates that there must be a sense of normalisation of this type of abuse as well, that so many people can recognise it. But we only had 92% of people reporting the abuse to the police, which indicates either a lack of trust in reporting to the police, or also that they didn't think the abuse would be treated seriously. So I think that's a really important point, and something we need to focus on in terms of education and awareness raising, is what the harms and impacts of this type of abuse are, because they are significant.
Yeah, and they're minimised, aren't they? It feels like it's minimised, and maybe that's because you can't actually see the impact of the behaviour. There's a sense of sort of distancing when you're using a platform or using a device.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the perpetrators we spoke with who engaged in abusive behaviour against friends and partners, but also against strangers, would describe engaging in the abuse and then going and having dinner with their kids and not realising that it was actually that they caused all this harm, and then go back and check what had happened on the Twitter where they engaged in the abusive behaviour and see what controversy they'd sparked and things like that. So I do think there is a real minimising, as you've said, Padma, of the harms that occur.
This could be for any of you. How should tech abuse be addressed through primary prevention? We've talked about awareness raising. Are there other forms of primary prevention that we should be thinking about? Joanne?
Yeah, good question, Padma. Thank you. And I suppose there is, but like all forms of gender-based violence, the forms of primary prevention are really about gender equality. That's what we're talking about. Technology is another tool that perpetrators use to cause harm to people, whether they're in an intimate partner relationship or, as Asha just described, complete strangers. The ability of men to use that for their own purpose because they wish to control whoever it is as the focus of their abuse is what that's about. So really, if we're serious in the primary prevention space, we're really talking about gender equality, and we're talking about all of those aspects of a woman's life that keep her subordinate to men and that keep us in caring professions. All of that needs a look at. So we're talking about minimising the gender pay gap, we're talking about women in leadership positions, we're talking about women in decision-making roles, we're talking about access to childcare, the distribution of unpaid domestic labour, all of those things. It's not necessarily about teaching respectful relationships, although that's a really important part of ongoing education, but it's not about people in their relationships necessarily. It's about stopping the abuse, and that's about gender equality.
Great. Another question for you, Asha. Did the research examine the impact of TFA on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women compared to non-Aboriginal women? So we talked about the higher rates in Aboriginal communities, but was there a correlation with Aboriginal women?
Yes, there was, and sorry, we didn't get a chance to report on everything within this seminar. Yes, there was higher rates, much higher. So 7 in 10 of our Indigenous and First Nation respondents reported experiencing victimisation, and we did see higher rates of that when we broke it down to look at Indigenous women versus men. There were higher rates of women who identified as experiencing victimisation at least once in their lifetime. And I think the work of Bronwyn Carlson in this space is really important to kind of start to look and break down some of the factors that might be contributing to that. And I mean, Bronwyn talks a lot about the idea of shared digital technologies between Indigenous communities, and also this idea that it's meant to be that Indigenous communities can use online spaces as a positive platform, but then at the same time, because there's higher uptake, it becomes a source of harassment and abuse. So it is something that I think, and that's one of the major findings of our research and report, is that there does need to be a real intersectional focus on any type of response and research to tech-facilitated abuse, that we need to be looking at things through a gendered lens, but also through an intersectionality lens as well. So thank you for the question.
You didn't break it down in terms of migrant and refugee communities. Did we have that data?
No, we had some data on people where English wasn't their first language at home in the report. I don't have the stats specific to that on me right now, but that should be in the report if you want to have a look at that. Again, we had to base the survey data on their most recent experience of tech-facilitated abuse. But yes, there is some reports of that, and there were higher rates again for people who didn't speak English as a first language at home compared to those who did.
Interesting. Another question that's come through for Asha and Joanne. Was there a difference between the amounts of anonymous technology facilitated abuse and abuse from an identifiable perpetrator? Did perpetrators shift between identifiable and de-identified forms, or did they stick mostly to one type? That's a really good question. Asha?
Yeah, excellent question. So perpetrators in our study, most prominently, they identified as perpetrating against, so it was around 48% identified as perpetrating against a partner or intimate partner. In terms of against a stranger, I believe it was 1 in 10 said that they perpetrated against a stranger. For the survey, for the victimisation, again, we had very high rates of intimate partner. I think it was around 38% said it was an intimate or former partner, and it was very low rates, again, perhaps less than 1 in 10 who were perpetrated, experienced it by a stranger. What we did find in the interviews, though, when we were able to delve into some of the stories, is the ways that even known perpetrators would hide their identity to be able to commit the abuse. So when they got blocked on one platform or their phone number got blocked, they would create fake profiles to be able to follow and harass the victim on social media. They would block their phone number, so they would call on private, and they would create new email addresses and contact the victim through different ways, such as through their work accounts or through their, for one example, the woman was the social media person for her child's school, and so they contacted her through that account, again, through hiding their identity. So we saw a real mix of both, but the underpinning factor when we were talking about an intimate partner or former intimate partner context was the perpetrator wanted the survivor to know it was them, even when they were masking the identity. The masking of the identity was to protect them from police intervention.
It's fascinating. There's a question on the workforce capacity building and how do we actually keep in front of emerging technologies. But maybe, Carolyn, you could speak to that from the eSafety Commissioner's perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, so as many people may not know, eSafety provides training for frontline workers in tech-facilitated abuse, both face-to-face webinars, virtual training, and we also have an online learning system for people who can't do it face-to-face. So it's a self-paced system. And that training's been developed in partnership with experts in the field of domestic and family violence. It's continually updated and improved with contact with frontline services. And those frontline services, they include domestic and family violence support services, police, domestic and violence liaison officers within the police. But we try to get as many workforces as we can involved that are having immediate contact with victim survivors of domestic and family violence, because we know that it can just be a trusted person that someone might reach out to help for help with, and so we want to make sure as many people as possible can access our training and understand both what tech facilitated abuse is and how to respond in ways that keep women and other victims of domestic and family violence and tech-facilitated abuse safe. So that information about all of that training is available. And the other ways that we keep up to date is internally. We have our industry and our investigations areas of eSafety. So we're make sure we're touching base with them regularly to find out what's the latest information that they have on the ways that technology is being misused. And we can incorporate that within our training and help those frontline workers be as responsive as possible.
Thank you, Carolyn. And awareness raising clearly was a central sort of lesson from this important research. We've come to the end of our Q&A session. But I'd just like to say to Asha, this is just such amazing research. And I think the fact that you've had so much interest in it speaks to how important the research is. But can I thank you all for this discussion today. We had so many more questions, a really engaged audience, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you, and thank you to the audience for your participation. So as I said before, the webinar recording will be available on the ANRO's website soon for on-demand viewing. Please tell all your colleagues. As you exit the webinar, a short feedback survey will open in a new window. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And for any researchers tuning in today, if you're working on projects addressing violence against women, please include your projects on our Register of Active Research on ANROSA's website. It's centralised and publicly available, and it's a great database of current work on domestic and family violence. So thank you again to the panelists and to our audience. I'm Padma Raman on behalf of ANROS. Bye for now.